Welcome to the Welsh Politics Podcast, where we take you beneath the surface of what's really going on in Welsh politics today, explaining not just the what, but the how and the why of what's happening. I'm Laura McEvatt, political commentator and former Conservative Special Advisor in the Wales office, and I'm joined by Prof Laura McAllister from the Welsh Govt Centre and Lee Waters, MS. We've waited for the dust to settle now on Caerphilly. And the extraordinary result of Lindsay Whittle being elected. And so we are going to delve into that today and see what that looks like from its own standalone electoral point of view as a by-election, but also for what it might mean as we go into May next year. So, Laura, if we can start with you, do you have any big reflections on the night, on a pretty exciting night in Welsh politics?
Well, it was certainly a momentous political occasion in Welsh politics, without a doubt. And I think it's great to have this space now to think about what actually happened, because all of us who are caught up in the maelstrom of an election have to respond quickly. And sometimes we say things that perhaps with the benefit of hindsight are not entirely accurate or well evidenced, but we've had a little bit more time and we have nearly 2 weeks to think about it. I think first and foremost, this is a remarkable result for Plaid Cymru. You should always start with the victor in any contest. And the reason that it's an incredible result is not just the share of the vote that Plaid got, which is approaching half of the votes cast, but also because this was being framed very deliberately by Reform and to a degree by the UK media, who started showing an interest latterly in the contest, as being a reflection of UK trends. So Plaid didn't really feature in that. How could it? Because obviously Plaid's only fighting elections in Wales. So for the UK media, and let's be perfectly frank, I'm sure you'd say the same, Laura, and I had more bids for interviews in that last week of the election than I've had for a lot of things recently from the UK media. But they wanted it to be a contest, obviously, between Labour and Reform, which it clearly was never going to be in Caerphilly. And all credit to Plaid Cymru, I think, for keeping its eye on the ball in terms of how it then managed the campaign, how it led its own candidate. We'll probably come on to talk about expectation management. So I think that's the big story. The second biggest story is, why didn't Reform win? And the two are related, obviously, aren't they? So I think for me, there needs to be more research now on whether that 36%, a third of people who vote, is some kind of ceiling for Reform. And I don't mean that the party can't potentially break into further ground. But of course, what it does is mobilise the anti-Reform parties to set themselves up as the only challenger to Reform, which then encourages tactical voting. So it throws up lots of really interesting issues around that for me.
Lee, the tactical voting thing is an interesting point here, where you saw sort of a rumour of a coalescing around Plaid Cymru to try and stop Reform. This is obviously the last first-past-the-post election for the Senedd. In May, we go to the closed list, multi-member, massive constituencies, which is sort of designed not to have a form of tactical voting associated with it. Do you think that we're still going to see tactical voting in May as a result? And how big a feature of sort of British and Welsh politics do you think this is going forward into that new electoral system?
I think that's really interesting, because I think psychologically we are hardwired to think about tactical voting. And because the new system is new, lots of people won't have thought about it. That's true of both the parties and of the general public. I think people's instinct will still to think tactically. So I think a lot of people will still be thinking and voting tactically, even though the system makes no sense for them to vote tactically, because they're still unused to how they should be behaving. So I suspect that narrative of we're going to stop this person. And of course, in the maths of the way the new system works, those fifth and sixth seats will be highly marginal. So there will be still a degree of tacticality in the way parties approach trying to get those fifth and sixth seats. The extent to which you can control that, I think, is unclear. But I think their mind will still be working in that way, would be my sense.
And just to jump in on that, even if there's very little point in voting tactically, the mentality of thinking about who you are opposed to is a really important choice dynamic, isn't it? And what we know about Reform is that it polarises opinions very dramatically. So people who don't want reform MSs will be looking for a party,
the strongest possible alternative
on the left, the strongest possible alternative to potentially be a party of government in Wales. But all of this, I think, we have to frame by the fact that we have very, very low levels of knowledge about the Welsh political system, the enlarged Senedd of 96 and the new voting system.
Yes.
So we've got to be careful that we're not assuming that there is a depth of understanding of all of those things amongst the electorate at the moment. Let's hope that improves in the run-up.
Just to jump back to our previous topic about the way why the voting system was chosen, and this is one of the ironies about the closed list system that we now have, it forces a binary choice. You only pick one party. And the alternative, which is the single transferable vote, allowed you to rank your party. So you could say, for example, I would vote Labour first, but Plaid second. And in that way, because we know there's quite a lot of overlap between Labour and Plaid voters, you could for example, if we'd seen that in Caerphilly, you'd have people voting maybe Plaid first, but Labour second. So Labour wouldn't have just collapsed. Yeah. Well, under the forced choice sort of clause list, you're going to have a collapse.
We who worked on it told Labour that from the very beginning. Let's be frank about this. In 2017, we briefed Labour at UK level because they said
I told you so, bragging rights.
Yeah. Well, it's there's a lot of irony here. Because STV, not only STV would have benefited Labour, but open lists would have benefited Labour because they could, if you'd had open flexible lists, there would have been a chance of prioritising a popular candidate. No longer have that, which is going to play badly for Labour as well.
Well, let's talk about that knowledge base for a minute, because there's two things that were at play in Caerphilly that are very interesting going into May. The first is that you had a very well-known local candidate who it was his 14th time of trying, and this was a name brand that was well-known locally. The second interesting feature for me is that in a system where the electoral system is well understood, which first past the post is, we had a very, very high turnout. Does that reform antipathy in parts of the country, and indeed the other side of that polarisation, that really pro-reform mentality, does that drive turnout again in May under a completely new system which is less well known? Or are we going to see a lower turnout regardless because it's a less well-known system?
Well, people vote, Laura, don't they, when they think something is at stake. Yeah. Oh, the academics have long described devolved elections as second-order elections, which is an international categorisation. You're not choosing the Prime Minister, you're not choosing the government of the UK, therefore it is less important and fewer people come out. And I guess what we saw in Caerphilly was something was at stake, something did matter to people, and so that drove turnout.
So do you think that translates into May? Do you think that antipathy, that sort of hostility towards the polarising mentality continues into May, or that lesser known new system continues the trend of a struggle to get high turnout in Senedd elections?
We don't know if it will continue, is the first thing to say, but there are a couple of things, as well as the second order theme, that impact on turnout, which is how competitive the election is. So if we have a competitive election, whether that's between Reform and Plaid, or if there is a resurrection of Labour support and it becomes more competitive with the other parties, so that helps. Degree of polarisation is significant as well. It's very unlikely this is going to be a less polarised election, so that plays well into turnout. I don't actually think the electoral system is a massive factor in turnout, because we've had another relatively complex electoral system operating for the whole of devolution, which people didn't really understand.
No.
And that was reflected by how people used their vote for the regional lists. So I don't think the electoral system is the big thing. The Welsh election would be competing for attention, though, this time, won't it, with the Scottish election and the local elections in England and so on. So we won't have all of the UK media trained on this, because let's not kid ourselves, without the UK media trained on Caerphilly, the trends might have been slightly different.
Except that you can already see the media narrative building that if Labour loses Wales,
yes,
that's trouble for Keir Starmer. So I think there still will be a London focus on the Senedd elections through their own prism, through how it plays into their story.
To hear what you think about this, Lee, because it's only now that this is credible, that no comeback for Scottish Labour or a marginal comeback for Scottish Labour. That's almost as bad, given how long the SNP have been in power in Scotland. So
and the poor performing public services, which are well accepted as a problem.
So from a Labour point of view, and from a media point of view on Labour, there's two really interesting complementary stories there. And then why can't Labour win in Scotland, having been out of power for so long?
Having won the Campbellton by
exactly, and why is it losing Wales? So that's what I mean. Attention might be more evenly distributed on Scotland and Wales.
Let's talk for a minute.
A degree of interest and sophistication of the new ones.
Let's talk for a minute.
But they not prove it.
Let's talk for a minute about expectation management and communications and media coverage, because they are kind of linked in together. How the parties communicate with the media ends up being how the electorate views the electoral landscape going into an election. There's a feeling that Reform played the expectation management game quite poorly going into this particular by-election. There was a lot of national media focus on Wales, as we said. You saw that in the media scrum immediately after the announcement. The result was announced, where Tulare from the BBC was interviewing Lindsay Whittle, and everybody else was sticking a camera in the Reform candidate's face. Do you think that they played this? They played that. They overplayed their hand in the communication sense.
Well, just on that point about that scrum, because a lot's been read into that about how the UK media weren't interested in Wales. But having spoken to some of the journalists involved, they made the rather more prosaic point that the Reform candidate didn't give a speech and looked like he was going to bolt for the door. So clearly the Plaid candidate was tied up in a BBC interview, so they all took the opportunity.
So are we buying that, though?
Well, it's plausible.
Well, and there were
partially.
There were very few, because I was there that night, there were very few Reform people left in the room at that point.
Yeah.
Nigel Farage was apparently last seen heading towards Helston Service Station.
The decision not to make a concession speech was poorly judged.
I think particularly when the by-election was called for the reason that...
Yeah, and I thought Lindsay Whittle was brilliant and sincere in the tribute he paid to Hefin David, and I thought that was absolutely appropriate.
It's the right pitch.
And the fact that Reform didn't respond in a similar term and was so, spoil sports about it, reflected very poorly on them. So I think the media then pouncing to try and get their moment kind of makes sense to me, but that wasn't the question. To be fair, did Reform overplay their hand? Well, Labour were never going to win this. I think the narrative and the momentum was definitely Reform side, and that's what we said when we last spoke about it. Reform were going up in the polls, Plaid were holding steady in the polls, Labour were falling in the polls. So I think the starting point assumption that Reform were going to win is a defensible one. They had all that media attention behind them. Plaid were very quiet. They didn't have a lot of confidence at the start of this campaign that they were going to win. Hence, we discussed last time putting Lindsay Whittle forward, as it turned out to be quite a clever strategy. But at the time, it felt like a lack of confidence. They were just putting up whoever they had on hand rather than putting forward a more dynamic candidate. But I think it speaks to the fact that Plaid weren't confident they were going to win. Even the day before, they were still very uncertain. Whereas Reform bet the farm on it and were very confident. And that arrogance actually played into the hands of their opponents, because it made people really think and concentrate. Well, Reform are going to win. Do we want Reform to win? And that's where the Labour strategy collapsed, because people voted with their feet. They didn't take any notice of the Labour messaging, which was, this is neck and neck, Labour could win, which is absurd. The people discounted that completely and used their own judgment to say, we don't want these people to win. We're going to vote for Plaid Cymru.
Yes, I think it was inevitable that Reform framed the by-election as one that they were the favourites to win. But I think they made some kind of schoolboy errors as well about how they approached the whole Welsh scene. I don't think they had enough internal intelligence about where there are different trends and different identities in Wales that could play as a collaboration against them. I think they were a little bit dismissive of the challenge from Plaid that they'd seen in the polls, because, whilst we debated whether Plaid had plateaued or not, we didn't really get to grips with whether Reform were also reaching the potential ceiling for support, particularly in Wales, where you have more electoral choices on the left than you do in England. And I think as a result, Reform approached it as a kind of quasi-British by-election with a little bit of a Welsh dimension rather than the other way around, which of course played well for Plaid Cymru, because the party was then able to present itself, particularly with a candidate like Lindsay Whittle, as really entrenched in the local community, a defence, a bulwark against the kind of pressures that people felt, understandably. And I also think that the emphasis that Reform put on migration as if it was the only issue of concern is clearly an issue of concern to people. And I don't buy that kind of narrative of, oh, well, only 2.3%.
No, I don't buy that.
People in Caerphilly. Because it's a nonsense narrative, because it assumes that people only are concerned about their patch and can't see a bigger picture. And it's a bit patronising.
I think it does a big disservice to the election.
And it also applies in the face of all the evidence that we know these people in areas where immigration is low are the ones who fear it the most.
Quite. Just like Brexit. We've got the data from Brexit about why people... Anyway.
It's a fair point to make.
It is, but it's not the only thing that affected. But going back to expectation management, does expectation management really matter in terms of the outcome? And that's the question I would pose, because it potentially creates conditions for parties to be less sure-footed as the campaign progresses, because they suddenly realise they're not necessarily outright favourites. But we're only talking about campaign management here. If you'd asked people in Caerphilly at the very start of that election, I think properly, not a vox pop on the street, I think a lot of people would have said, I think Plaid Cymru can win, but I also think Reform could win, which proved to be pretty much the way it went right up to the day of the election. So the expectation management thing, I don't know what else Reform could have done. Maybe be a bit more humble, but that was unlikely with the candidate and the
I think they struck the correct tone, didn't they? You know, the standard moment everyone talks about was the TV debate, where you had a member of the public with a mixed race son who said that she'd felt uncomfortable in her town for the first time and blamed the Reform candidate explicitly, and he sort of rolled his eyes. And that was the moment that crystallised the public mood turning against Reform.
Do you think Reform can capitalise upon this next May, capitalise upon sort of national narratives next May to get high turnout again at the election and get people voting on non-Senedd-based issues? Because from what I can see, they have the potential for a similar difficulty to the one the Conservatives had for many years, which was getting turnout at a general election and then having a category of people who didn't bother showing up for Assembly and then Senedd elections because they didn't think that this entity should exist. Reform are choosing not to address the abolish question at all. And so there's a group of voters who just are still not going to show up for them. Do you think that in how they approach this particular election, they're going to have the same struggle in May next year?
I'm not sure abolish is at play in the same way you're suggesting it is here, because I think the people who are attracted to Reform, some of them, are non-voters. So it's not about should we have a Senedd versus not have a Senedd. It's we hate it all, we hate you all, we're all terrible. So I'm not really sure that's the dynamic that you think it is presently. What was very surprising about the by-election, as far as we understand it, there's very few new people registered to vote. And we know that in Wales there's something like 400,000 people who are not registered to vote, which is a staggering figure. And that was Reform's, the Brexit strength in that referendum campaign is people who previously hadn't voted came out to vote and weren't showing in the polls. Whereas I think that's going to be the question for May, is to the extent to which they will learn the lessons of Caerphilly and recalibrate, Reform, and work hard on getting people who are not registered to register. I think that's what they will do. I don't think Reform see this as the last word. I think they will regroup.
Yes, look, it's still everything to play for, isn't it? If anybody who thinks that, the Caerphilly result has predetermined the type of campaign that we'll see in the run-up to the Senedd elections is kidding themselves. Because both Plaid Cymru and Reform will have learnt lessons from this by-election, and you would hope the two so-called main parties who are no longer main parties will also have done their own post-mortems and decided what they need to do differently in the run-up to May next year.
That's very sweet of you, Laura.
I'd be trying to be kind here, yeah.
Well, let's talk about the previous main party in Caerphilly.
Just before we move on, because I think that's a really key point. I think there's a real danger now that the left become complacent here. They breathe a sigh of relief. Isn't it great we stopped Reform? And that's somehow going to happen again in May. And I don't think that's
well, let's talk about Labour for a moment. Was this by-election about Labour failure in London or Labour failure in Cardiff, do you think?
I think it was a by-election of people who are absolutely fed up with Labour for all of those reasons. And our campaign didn't help it. There's an arrogance of our campaign, which was so divorced from the reality on the ground that made us utterly irrelevant to the debate. Even the day before polling, we were putting out leaflets with absurd bar graphs suggesting
You went full Lib Dem on the bar charts.
And the people who were involved, the activists who were involved, were scratching their heads. This is embarrassing. People are laughing at us, and yet the party machine kept up this narrative that we're competitive. And then immediately after the result, you had party spokespeople saying, "Oh well, it's just a blip in the bio, so people will come back to us." That's nonsense and arrogant.
Within the Labour machine that you've referenced there, are those types of decisions one that come from London or ones that come from Cardiff?
Well, I think what's really interesting, the internal dynamic at play here, is that the central party has completely taken over. This was essentially run by-election campaign.
From London?
Yeah, it was a Senedd by-election. But the UK party sort of assumed control. They dictated the messaging. There was very little Welsh input. There was lots of fighting behind the scenes to try and regain some control, which was largely ineffective. The ground movement came from London, and it is to Labour's UK's credit that they invested as much as they did, and the staff were all diverted to help. You had lots of MPs coming down, and a very few local activists were willing to go out and campaign. There was lots of people from outside the constituency making up the numbers. But I think that points to a profound weakness, really, in the local Labour machine. But this battle over the messaging, and that's why I think many of us think the campaign was so tone deaf, is it was not calibrated to local sensitivities and understanding.
But you reap what you sow, don't you, in any environment? And this has been coming for a long, long time for Labour in Wales. That Lee, you were talking about arrogance or complacency, but also the balance of power between London Labour and Welsh Labour. Sure. So much so that you end up feeling sorry for the leadership of Welsh Labour, but then you remind yourself that there were opportunities to challenge this. And everything that we've talked about in our pods, including the electoral system and all the rest of it, has come about because there isn't a respectful relationship that is based on a belief that Welsh Labour could do things differently, but in a complementary way to UK Labour. And the kind of iron fist of UK Labour over everything that's gone on in Wales has now reached a point where it's visible to voters as well. And there was very little Labour could have done in this election that would have convinced people to vote for it, I think.
No, I agree.
The election was over from the day it was called in terms of Labour's vote. So we can anguish over the campaigns and who controlled them. But even had Welsh Labour had greater control, and I think it would have been a better campaign, more appropriate campaign, there was no way Labour was going to win this by-election.
So we've talked a little bit about the road to May electorally and what happens between now and May, but obviously one of the big things that happens within Welsh Government terms is the budget, and this changes the mathematics in relation to the budget. Do you see Plaid Cymru helping Labour to pass a budget now? Do you see or are Plaid going to want to divorce themselves from Labour more fully in the mindset of the electorate so that they can run very, very separately from Labour on the left in May?
Well, that's the question of the hour, isn't it? And just, the maths are we have now 28 seats out of the 60, and clearly you cannot pass a budget on 28 seats. Previously, we've been able to get Plaid Cymru to agree to abstain. So they never voted in favour of a Labour budget, but they have abstained. And last time, Jane Dodds, the sole Liberal Democrat, also agreed to abstain. And that allowed us to pass our budget because only the Conservatives were voting against.
Yeah.
This time that's going to be different. We're going to need more than abstentions to get our budget through. And so we have a limited number of options of where that support might come from. So the Conservatives have made a play about being willing to sit down and talk. But that's a gimmick.
Yeah.
And there's no seriousness behind it.
Well, if you abolish stamp duty, we're willing to talk.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, that does those numbers do not stack up. And I'm afraid...
Well, the power games don't stack up either. Why would you allocate so much of the slush fund, if you like, for something that, is...
Well, abolishing stamp duty would cost way in excess of the money that's available.
Exactly.
And it also shows, I'm afraid, the calumness and the emptiness of the Conservatives' tactics, that they think this is clever politics and, it could backfire on them insofar as that matters, given they're polling so poorly. So then what are the options? There's Plaid Cymru agreeing to abstain again, which they clearly don't want to do. And I can understand the chemistry from their point of view, because if they were to allow our budget to go through, they'll immediately be tarred by reform as propping up a failing Labour government. So
and you're voting for more of the same then next May.
So they are going to be understandably tactically and politically nervous about that. But we have to get the budget through, which is in Plaid Cymru's interest, and we discussed previously how it could backfire on them.
And just
lock a budget.
Just for our listeners who aren't as au fait as we are, what is the timeline on that?
Well, can we just finish going through the maths first, figure out what the options are. So the actual budget doesn't need to be passed until the end of March. It's traditionally passed in January, but these are movable feasts. Plus, we've got the UK budget being very late in the year this year, so that all affects the timing. But just to finish the conversation on where those votes could come from, so Jane Dodds, the Liberal Democrat, has indicated she'd be willing to have talks to support this year's budget, but that would still only take us up to 29, or if she abstained, the knock-on of that. Then, of course, there's the wild card. You have some members sitting in the Senedd now who are off the party whip. So you have a former Plaid Cymru member, Rhys ap Owen, who is an independent. You have a former Conservative member, Russell George, who is off the whip. And you have the sole Reform Senedd member, Laura Ann Jones. So, it's possible to imagine a situation where one of them and Jane Dodds could agree to support the budget, and that would allow the government to get its budget through. I find it hard to see Plaid Cymru being willing to vote en masse. However, their position of, this is Labour's budgets to pass, it's not our job to help Labour pass its budget, that's their line, is really, I think, naive, because it's the Sened's job to pass a budget. Labour, in a sense, is a lame duck government from that point of view. We haven't got the votes to pass anything. We've got 28 votes out of 60. So unless we have consensus and cooperation and negotiation, nothing will happen from now until May. And we have to have a budget by law. So somebody has to compromise here, or the Senedd won't have a budget passed. Wales will not have public services funded. And that's disastrous.
To be fair, I understand what Lee's saying, but, we're in a very febrile political environment. In normal years, it would be a fair critique of Plaid's take. But in this year, in the run-up to an election, you can see entirely why Plaid Cymru is taking the position it is. It's suggesting that it's up to Labour to have offered arrangements with other parties if it wanted support much earlier, rather than, brinkmanship in this sense. The point you make about independence, the problem with that is the character, if you like, of the independents and how that would be portrayed. But it might actually be the least worst evil in terms of getting the budget through. But I think fundamentally, no party or no individual MS wants the budget not to go through, because the repercussions of that are very, very significant politically for everybody. So there will have to be a deal. I'm not close enough to know how that will be framed. I think the abstention, Jane Dodds and the independents are probably the terrain you're looking at. But it's in everybody's interest to get the budget passed.
Sure, but your point about, Plaid having a fair point about saying Labour needs to bring forward a proposition they can support. That involves Plaid Cymru talking to the Welsh Government and setting out their parameters, and they have refused to do so. So this is not some kind of Labour have badly handled this. This is Plaid actively deciding not to cooperate. And I can understand their tactics from their point of view, but it's disingenuous to then turn around and say, this is Labour's budget to pass, because Labour hasn't got the numbers. Mark Drakeford has put forward essentially a bare bones budget with no political decisions, and saying this is up now for discussion, and Plaid are refusing to discuss. Which, says tactically defensive, but if they want to be a party of government, they need to think beyond May, because if they do become the largest party, they're going to need the support of other parties to pass their budget. And, there's a danger that they create precedents now, or set curdled relationships now, which will backfire on them after May.
But Lee, in this period, in a run-up to an election, it's far more about tactics to get elected than it is looking beyond the date of the election.
Yes.
Whether we think that's good, bad, or immoral or wrong is neither here nor there, because that's exactly what goes on in every
that's right.
democratic system.
Let's return to that in another episode,
because
I think the question of what faces an incoming government of whatever
it's incredible, and
is something no one's thinking about.
No, and it's quite terrifying in many respects.
It's going to be tough for anybody.
Yeah.
Well, it means it's a pretty interesting road into May next year, and lots and lots and lots for us to chew over between now and then. Thanks for joining us for another Welsh Politics podcast. If you've enjoyed what you've heard, please do rate our podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all your chosen media platforms. Subscribe and follow us on social media. We'll be back with you again soon with another Welsh Politics podcast.